Welcome to History 111, Lecture 12, The Revolution. In many ways, the Revolution begins with the Intolerable Acts of 1774 and the colonial response to them. And remember, these are passed by the British government to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. Now, the First Continental Congress votes to ban all trade with Britain until those acts are repealed. But more importantly, people start organizing militias to resist what they see as British infringement on their rights. And when British troops are ordered to Lexington and Concord to seize colonial stores of weapons, then fighting breaks out, and that gets nicknamed the shot that's heard around the world because at that point open fighting is happening. And remember, there's a big division between patriots and loyalists within the colonies, and by no means does everyone support this fighting. The Second Continental Congress meets in 1775, and in the beginning they're concerned with trying to repair relations with Britain through things like the Olive Branch Petition, but as more and more fighting is going on, they start working on documents like the Declaration of the Cause of Necessity of Taking Up Arms, and they start looking at things like establishing a Continental Army, which they in fact do when they go ahead and put under the command of George Washington. And early on in 1775, George Washington is going to fight the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now the British are going to win, but it's going to be at a big cost, and that's going to prove the war is going to be long and bloody. But importantly, for colonial propaganda, that means that they're not going to be defeated quickly and that they are actually going to be able to fight and stand up and have a chance at things. So more and more the propaganda mill spins up, and a really important piece of propaganda gets written in 1776. It's by Thomas Paine. It's called Common Sense, and it's an argument for why the rebellion is right and why independence is deserved by the colonies. Also in 1776, they go ahead and pen the Declaration of Independence, and what that really represents is the Continental Congress trying to take control of the revolutionary movement. And there's a lot of key ideas in it that are going to be built on later in American government. Things about abuses and self-evident truths, rights, equality, consent of the governed, and so on is very deeply rooted in John Locke and the Enlightenment. But do realize while this document is going to be central to later American liberties, it says very little about the rights of women, slaves, and the poor. And again, it's important to know that these calls for independence are coming from one particular group of people. Now, John Adams, a future American president, is going to later admit that at this point, only about one third of people supported the revolution. Another third opposed it outright, and about one third just didn't care either way what happened. And so, out of this, there's not a huge amount of public support, but there is a strong core. Now, the committees of correspondence that have been in existence for a while, working on propaganda and so on, they're going to turn into draft boards in areas that are under colonial control, and they're going to order townsmen to register for the Continental Army, and refusal to do so could result in imprisonment. Now, importantly, a lot of elites could buy their way out of service for themselves, or their sons, or their friends, and this is going to lead in some areas to charges that it's a poor man's fight and a rich man's war. So when it comes to the two sides, we should know the British are the best trained army in the world at this stage and rely on very harsh discipline. The Continental Army, on the other hand, is trained by George Washington. They're infrequently paid and they occasionally mutiny. Now we should know that both also have major issues with hunger and disease, and both armies are drawn primarily on the lower class citizens. Now, as the revolution emerges, we should know that each side has certain advantages. Britain has wealth, confidence, professional army, quite a bit of firepower, a very strong navy to work with. But distance and supplies are a problem for them, whereas the colonists, they're fighting on their home turf. They're fighting a defensive war. They're fighting with the French later on. They have a dispersed population, which makes it very difficult for the British to control, and it's a very large region. And one thing is both an advantage and a disadvantage. There's local non-combatants. They're fighting in a space where you have to be careful because the fighting can turn people for you or against you, and that largely favors the colonists, but doesn't always do so. Now, these two sides are going to pursue very different strategies. For the Americans, the goal is very simple. It's going to be to force England to withdraw its military and then to grant colonies independence. So George Washington is going to focus on things like preserving his army, because as long as his army exists, the revolution continues. He's going to avoid regular battles, because in those regular battles, he is likely to lose and sustain huge casualties. He's fighting the best army in the world with an army that's not always well supplied, not always well trained, although they are committed to their cause. So if he can drag this out, that's what's going to keep the revolution going. Now, he's going to launch raids against English outposts and isolated units where he can win. So in other words, he's going to fight only the battles he can win, because that keeps the revolution going. Washington's entire strategy is based on the premise that during a long war, people in Britain are going to start demanding peace. In the beginning, they're going to demand victory. When it's clear that victory is not going to happen, they're going to demand peace at any price. And that's eventually going to force the opposition parties back in Britain to take up the issue. And eventually, it's going to become an issue in the House of Parliament. And eventually, that's going to mean peace because people back in Britain won't support the war anymore. For the British, the goal's a little bit different. Their thought is they had the best army in the world. Why don't they just go ahead and crush the rebellion with overwhelming military might? And all they have to do in their mind is capture strategic points and hold them. And it turns out their experience of the war teaches them that there really aren't any strategic points in the Americas to hold. Because they thought this rebellion was small number of troublemakers. And in the beginning, there was a little bit of truth to that, but this is spreading. They don't understand how widespread this rebellion is going to become. What they discover is there just aren't strategic points because the rebellion is everywhere and there's really no way to contain it. So, in the very beginning of the war, it's marked by two things: Britain's reluctance to engage fully, and Washington's victories. And one of the key important ones are Trenton and Princeton, where there are swift attacks, elements of surprise, and so on. And what really is happening is, again, George Washington is fighting battles he knows he can win, key little raids, and making the British chase them around the countryside. And they're just unwilling to commit to that type of strategy. The British think that they simply can hold certain key cities, and that George Washington will run out of supplies in the woods somewhere. And the more and more they do that, the more and more he wins little raids and starts to make things look bad. Now, Saratoga in New York in 1777 is a British retaliation for some of Washington's actions. And what happens there is there's an uncoordinated attack, and the British general Burgoyne is defeated, and that's going to boost morale. But more important than boosting morale with a win, it convinces the French that these colonists have a chance at victory, and that's going to have long-term consequences. And what happens out of that is, more and more as this war goes on, this becomes a multinational effort against the British. The French are going to come in as allies in 1778, and they're going to be concerned with curbing British power, building future trade relations, and ultimately, the French are going to play a critical role at a battle called Yorktown. And that battle is going to be the point at which the British can't come back, and it's going to be the point at which is going to lead to the British withdrawal from the colonies. Now, while the Spanish themselves do not become allies anywhere during this, the Spanish decide to take advantage of the fact that Britain is distracted with this colonial war, and they begin to raid British shipping. And the more the Spanish raid British shipping, the less supplies get to British soldiers, and that all ultimately plays a contributing factor in how the revolution goes. So around the same time the colonists begin to get all these allies and all this help from Europe, the British start to rethink their war strategy. And instead of concentrating on holding key cities like New York and Boston, the British are going to look at the South, because the South very early on was a base of strong support for the British. Now, the British are also able to gain some key victories in the South, and the Battle of Charleston in 1779 is the biggest American defeat in the war. So they're going to try to control the South and concentrate their soldiers there to really bring that region under control and cut it off from the rest of the rebellion. And part of that is simply because it's going to be the easiest because it's where they have the strongest support. And that goes very well for a couple of years until the Battle of Cowpens. And that's a complicated maneuver that's still taught in military schools today that involves a fake surrender and surprise attack. But the long and short of it is the British are forced to withdraw across South Carolina. And it appears to a lot of people that the British aren't withdrawing, but rather they're fleeing from American attackers. And what's going to happen is that's going to turn public opinion as can be used for propaganda, and importantly what's going to happen is the British are going to be forced back into holding the key cities, and they're not going to hold the rural areas because they can't secure supply lines, and the Americans are going to be able to really exploit that. So the British General Cornwallis withdraws from Cowpens and decides he's going to head to a place called Yorktown in Virginia, and he's going to hold the war there, rebuild his strength, gain key control of what he thinks of strategic points, and then push back out into colonies. But that's not going to work because the Americans are going to plan a fake attack in the north that's going to allow them to link up with the French and surround them at Yorktown. And what happens is, after quite a long siege, Cornwallis is forced to surrender, and that basically ends the British campaign in the south. But the king and the British Parliament at the time are going to insist on continuing fighting for a while. Although the fighting continues after the Battle of Yorktown, really at this stage, everyone sees a light at the end of the tunnel and everybody knows kind of where this is going. And so you start to see a lot of problems emerge, and a lot of soldiers begin to protest the lack of pay and treatment they had received, and there's a number of small mutinies, and in various places there's threats of civil war between different factions and so on, and a lot of effort is being spent by the Continental Army just keeping order. Now, after Yorktown, negotiations do begin, and the Peace of Paris is established in 1783, and that's negotiated by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. And importantly for the United States, England accepts independence and sets boundaries that are quite a bit larger than the boundaries of the actual 13 colonies. There's a lot of territory gained in the French and Indian War that was transferred over. Now, an important piece of territory that was gained during the French and Indian War that doesn't go to the United States is the two Floridas. Back then, it was East Florida, was what we simply call Florida today, and then West Florida, that's southern Alabama, Mississippi. Both those territories, both Floridas, are going to go back to Spain at this stage. While the revolution began as a small segment of society trying to push the colonies a certain direction, as it continued, a lot of other people became involved, and a lot of women fought in the revolution. Now, while there are some stories about women taking up arms, most of the contributions by women were primarily in non-combatant roles. A lot of women worked in the camps, and a lot worked on the lines. And there's a nickname for women working on the lines back then, which is Molly Pitcher. And the whole idea was these women were running up and down the lines, delivering water and other supplies. In addition to that type of work, a lot of women worked as spies and messengers. With regards to African Americans, they fought on both sides. Primarily, though, African Americans fought on the British side. And what that has to do with is simply that a lot of the ones fighting on the British side were runaway slaves. The British promised any slave that ran away and joined their cause their freedom at the end of the war. On the other hand, about 5,000 African Americans fought for the U.S., mostly as workers and only a few soldiers. African Americans were very rarely armed by the American forces, and that has a lot to do with the South fearing rebellions and being generally unwilling to trust these individuals with guns. That has a lot to do with their existing prejudices. Now, with regards to Native Americans, there's about 200,000 living east of the Mississippi, and by and large, they want neutrality. And of those who are not going to stay neutral, they're going to largely help Britain. And the reason being, they realize that if Britain is defeated, this is going to remove the major obstacle for colonial expansion west. And if Britain goes, that's going to mean these new United States are going to begin encroaching on their lands. So they see it as being within their interest to support Britain. Do keep in mind that Native Americans, though, generally thought it wasn't their war. Unfortunately, though, there's a lot of problems this caused. This war for liberty and independence is going to take away liberty and independence from Native Americans. This war against colonial oppression is going to ultimately lead to the colonization and oppression of Native Americans by the U.S. government. In addition, American soldiers are going to be paid with Native American land, not what free land as it was claimed back then. In addition, the Paris Peace Treaty is also going to exclude Native Americans, and there's an idea that pervades most history textbooks that this is a war between colonists and the British. This is a war that also touched and deeply impacted Native Americans in a very negative way. So what's the big idea? Well, realize the population is split. Now, while Adams assessed it as being one-third for, one-third against, and one-third neutral, we also should know that 70% of those who signed the Declaration of Independence held offices in the British colonial government. This was the elite of the colonies trying to shove the British out to a certain degree in the beginning. There's a lot of class dimensions during the war, and do remember there are charges that it was a poor man's fight and a rich man's war. And really, ultimately, what we're looking at is a shift from British control to a control by new American elites. All that aside, this was, for a lot of people, a war for political ideas and philosophy, and it is going to create, albeit slowly, possibilities for groups to express their grievances and struggle for equality. Unfortunately, it's also going to be bad for Native Americans, and it's going to really strengthen Southern slavery. See you in the next lecture.